With the invention, around 7,000 years ago, of the written word in Egypt and, independently, in China, it became possible to have businesses of scale. With the invention of large-scale businesses in the same places, at the same time, it became necessary to have the written word, which was the cause of which lies outside the scope of the present inquiry. Since then, economies of scale, along with the political systems that hosted them, have risen and fallen. Setting aside communities that never came to host large-scale commerce, which are the very communities which did not develop their own systems of writing, there seem to be two, and only two, paths that a given society can take. Path 1. That society can grow in consequence of intelligence, thrift, industriousness, etc. on the part of some of its members and a high, if grudging, estimation of these traits on the part of its remaining members, and then fall because of increased parasiticism on the part of that society's members, made possible by the social and commercial instruments created by that society's founding fathers. This is the Rome-USA path. Path 2. That society's growth can be tempered by the very forces that make that growth possible, and that society remains stable and unchanging and, therefore, oppressively conservative for an indefinitely long period. This is the pre-2000 China model. The obvious thing to say is the USA is about to collapse, in the same way that Rome collapsed. The correct thing to say, so the present authors believe, is that the collapse occurred quite some time ago, which is obscured by the fact that the USA's collapse, unlike other collapses, involved an increase in people's personal fortunes and also by the fact that the pre-collapse structures, the same physical and social structures, are still in existence and still in use, though not, despite appearances, in the same use as before, and, further, that what economics conscious agents should focus on now is not the preservation of what used to exist, which is impossible, but is rather a reorganization of existing assets. Because the USA had the good fortune to collapse in a relatively painless way, and a way that was so painless, in fact, that people sought it as growth, even though it was the opposite, laypersons and scholars are under the impression that, although a collapse is on the horizon, there has not, as of yet, been a collapse. Strikingly, this very antiquated view is quite as much the view of the young as it is the old. The current generation of young adults, the millennials, meaning that were born between 1900–2000, have conservative, irritatingly conservative, if one is entrepreneurial, views as to how society should be. Youngsters today are more, not less, likely than their grandparents to go to school and college. They are more, not less, likely to become bankers, stockbrokers, and lawyers. More, not less, likely to become real estate agents. More, not less, likely to become professors. The development of digital technology has eliminated the need for some of these professions, or it has at least made it necessary to subject these professions to radical changes, and it has shown the rest to be the utter frauds that they are. Youngsters today trudge off to schools, which disseminate germs as efficiently as they prevent the dissemination of information, where, despite presumably, because so little is learned, they are likely to spend the next 25 years of their lives. They do this even though the internet makes it possible for each of these possible to an education that is tailored to his specific aptitudes and life situation, while involving none of the waste of ordinary non-digital education, the wasted time listening to incompetent teachers, the wasted resources of character, destroyed by numbing eternities spent in a counter-Darwinian survival of the least threatening to the teacher and to one's peers classroom environment, of physical schools. After they have put in their soul-destroying 25 years or so, they are quite useless, to themselves and therefore to others, since the lack of self-reliance and initiative rewarded by the educational system, which, proverbially, is staffed by those who are not the best and the brightest, they trudge off to their jobs at brokerage firms, banks, real estate agencies, public libraries, and law offices, all institutions that need not exist, given the as of the present, largely untapped resources of cyberspace, and should not exist, given therefore reasons to be described below radically wasteful nature. Among the professions not yet mentioned, but at the very top of the list is government bureaucrat. In 2012, for the first time in U.S. history, the government became the employer of more than 50% of the nation's workforce. Although law and order are necessary, they are not so necessary as to justify the gargantuan government agencies that employ most of the members of America's workforce. In fact, even though law enforcement agencies are larger, relative to the population and otherwise, than ever before, crime has never been higher, and only partly because the term crime has been so redefined as to legitimate the existence of various useless and expensive regulatory agencies, for example the DEA. Oddly, or not so oddly, given how oppressive and creativity-destroying the educational system is, young Americans have not pushed for the digitization of education, and they seem quite unaware of the very possibility that education should or even could be digitized. Quite the opposite. School has assumed the function, the emotional function, if not the practical function, once discharged by family, and youngsters today are, compared to their great-grandparents, strikingly backward-looking. Instead of trying to improve the economy, the millions upon millions of English majors and Latino studies majors whine about the state of the economy. When is the economy going to improve? They ask. It isn't, is the answer that their supposed teachers and role models don't give them, because those same role models don't know it to be the answer, since they don't want to know it, since they were themselves responsible for the massive governmental takeover, Orwellianly cloaked as extensions of civil liberties, of commerce and private life initiated in the 60s, all of which failed utterly, as is evidenced by the fact that, whereas in 1960, the African American community was self-sufficient, having its own physicians and engineers, whereas now there are very few trained professionals in the now almost entirely welfare-dependent community, and as is also evidenced by the fact that, whereas in 1960, women had, by their own estimation, an average of 70 free waking hours a week, that number has shrunk to 30. This is not to deny that progress has been made. There have been vast improvements in medicine, technology, and even, astoundingly, in pure thought. And even though the civil rights and women's liberation movements did not have exactly the results hoped for, they did succeed in tearing down unpleasant and unnecessarily restrictive social norms. But, to anticipate, those norms have been as much displaced as they have been eliminated. Black and white communities are extremely segregated, and black communities are now considerably more dangerous to their occupants than they were in 1960. Women have various newfound liberties, professional and recreational, but those liberties do them little good, given that the average woman today works longer hours than the average factory worker in Britain in 1880 and, unlike the factory worker, cannot in general look forward to going home after work to a loving family.